Our first project will be a simple lining exercise using a base, a tint, and a shade. We'll be understanding what a light source is and creating the three-dimensional illusion. We will be creating two separate panels in this painting. One will have a recessed panel in it, and the other one will have a protruding panel in it. I created these panels in Google SketchUp just to give you a visual reference. In order to create a three-dimensional illusion, you need three colors: a base, a tint, and a shade. We'll begin by adding two rectangles, the base color. We'll also draw an inner rectangle in each one. On the left, we'll paint this one to be recessed, and on the right, this one will be protruding. Before we can begin to paint, it's important to establish a light source. For this project, the light source is coming from the top right. Keeping this light source in mind, I'll use the tint and I'll paint in areas facing towards the light source. For the recessed area, it's on the left and the bottom, and the protruding is the top and on the right. I'll do the same with the shade or the low light, and I'll line in the areas away from the light source. Using simple lining with a light source in mind already gives this project a three-dimensional illusion. Now, in order to give it more depth, we'll cast some shadows on the shade side, away from the light source. Alright, let's begin our project. Here's the materials that you'll need. You'll need some paper towels, a couple of brushes, a scrap piece of watercolor paper, your project that you've drawn on watercolor paper, a cup of clean water, a set of gouache paint, and a paint mixing tray. Your first step is to draw this assignment on watercolor paper. You'll find a copy of it in Blackboard. The colors we're using for this project are cobalt blue, Prussian blue, and white. Let's begin by mixing the base color. Here I'm using cobalt blue and just a little bit of white. I've also added some water. You don't want the paint too thick, but you also don't want it too thin or translucent. You want to be able to spread the paint around easily on the surface. You also want to see your inking lines through the painting afterwards. I've added just a little bit of water just to thin it down a bit. It's really important that the base is completely dry before moving on to the next step. Once the base is dry, you can mix the shade or the low light color. Here I'm just using Prussian blue right out of the tube. I use that scrap piece of paper just to try out my lines and work on consistency of the paint. Then I'll line the areas away from the light source, like I showed you in the first example. Now I'll mix the tint or the highlight. I'm using cobalt blue and I'm adding a lot more white, making sure that it's lighter than the base color. I'm also adding a little bit of water so that the consistency of the paint isn't too thick. Then I'll go ahead and line all the areas facing towards the light source. I'm also doing the perimeter with the highlight and the low light, or the tint in the shade. You'll need to experiment with the amount of water you want to put in. Again, you don't want too much water, but enough so that the lines go on easily, like this. It's important to always keep the light source in mind when painting. For this project, it's coming from the top right. Next, I'll mix a shadow using black and a lot of water. I want this to be translucent. Once you've experimented, use a scrap piece of paper to try the consistency. Then cast the shadows underneath where the shade lines are. This will give the project more dimension. To recap, you've created two basic shapes and created a three-dimensional illusion using a base color, a tint, and a shade. You've also established where the light source was coming from and cast shadows to give it more depth. Next week, we'll be moving on and we'll be creating textures.